There was a time when buying a video game meant leaving the house entirely. It meant queuing outside a shop on the high street, sometimes past midnight, just to be first through the door on release day. That shop was Game. At its peak, Game ran close to 300 stores across Britain, and midnight launches turned high streets into campsites of sleeping bags and glow sticks. Staff knew every title on the shelf, and trading in an old game for pocket money felt like alchemy. For a generation of British gamers, it was simply the place. Today, most of those stores are gone. What survives trades under the same name, but from a rented counter inside somebody else's shop. How does a chain that once ruled every high street in Britain end up borrowing shelf space just to survive? This is the story of what disappeared when the game stopped being something to buy and became something to simply download. The story of Game does not begin with a games shop. It begins with two men walking away from one. In the early 1990s, Terry Norris and Bev Ripley already understood retail entertainment better than almost anyone in Britain. Through their company, City Vision, the pair had spent the 1980s building Ritz, a chain of video rental stores that grew into England's leading specialist video retailer. It was, by any measure, a success story, and then in early 1992, they sold it to the American giant Blockbuster Entertainment Corporation for a reported $65 million. For most people, that would have been the end of the chapter. For Norris and Ripley, it was the beginning of a new one. Rather than step back, the two men turned their attention to a market that most of the entertainment industry still treated as a novelty: video games. Home consoles were no longer toys for a handful of enthusiasts. The Sega Mega Drive had arrived in Britain in 1990, and the Super Nintendo would follow in 1992. And together these machines were pulling in a new, hungry audience of young players with nowhere dedicated to shop. High street video shops sold films. Toy shops sold games almost as an afterthought, buried on a shelf between board games and dolls. Nobody had built a shop that treated video games the way Ritz had once treated films, as the main event, not the sideline. Norris and Ripley set out to change that. They purchased a shell company named Rhino Group plc, and at the end of 1992, they launched its retail format, Future Zone. Initial funding came to roughly $6 million, and notably, part of that backing came from Blockbuster itself, the very company that had just bought their old business. It was, in effect, seed money from a former rival who believed the pair could do it again. The ambition was not modest. Norris and Ripley projected as many as 140 Future Zone stores. By the close of 1992, the first 6 had opened their doors. A Future Zone store in those early days looked nothing like a conventional shop of the period. Cartridges and CD cases lined the walls in neat rows. Demo units sat wired up so customers could test a game before they bought it, and staff were, for the first time on a British high street, expected to actually know the difference between a platformer and a beat-em-up. The early customers were exactly the audience Norris and Ripley had bet on: schoolboys and schoolgirls with pocket money burning a hole, and slightly older teenagers treating the shop as a place to loiter as much as to buy. By the end of 1993, there were 46 Future Zone stores trading across the country, and the format was edging close to profitability. A rare thing for a young retail chain in the recession-scarred Britain of the early 1990s. Norris and Ripley's core belief was simple, even if it sounds obvious now. Games deserve their own shop, not a shelf inside somewhere else, not an afterthought next to the toys. A destination built for people who took games seriously, long before the rest of the high street understood that such people existed in their millions. That belief would carry Future Zone through a decade of mergers, rebrands, and expansion, and eventually into the name that would come to define an entire generation of British shopping: Game. By the early 2000s, the shop that had started life as Future Zone had become simply Game. The rebrand was complete, the merger with Electronics Boutique long absorbed into the furniture, and the chain now stood close to 300 stores strong across every corner of Britain. This was its golden era, roughly the decade from 2000 to 2010, and it is the decade most gamers of a certain age remember not as a business, but as a habit. Go to any British town in that period, and the pattern repeated itself with almost ritual precision. School finished at 3:30, and within the hour, the local game had a small crowd of teenagers pressed against the glass, studying the new releases wall the way earlier generations might have studied a cinema listing. There was no pressure to buy. Looking was often the point. The shop was warm, it was bright, it smelled faintly of new plastic and carpet, and, crucially, nobody minded you standing there for 20 minutes deciding between two games you couldn't yet afford. What made Game different from a supermarket shelf or a catalog order was simple. The staff actually played the games they sold. Ask an assistant whether a football title was worth the money over last year's version, and you would get an honest, specific answer, not a shrug. For a teenager with a tightly rationed allowance, that kind of trusted advice mattered enormously. It was the difference between a wasted week's pocket money and a good one. Then there was trade-in, the mechanism that, more than any advertising campaign, built Game's relationship with its customers. A finished game, no longer wanted, could be carried in exchange for cash, or more often, credit towards something new. For families where money was tight, this was not a marginal convenience. It was how a child built a games collection at all. Swap the title you had finished for the one you wanted next, adding only a few pounds on top. An older sibling might trade in 3 games to help a younger one afford a console upgrade. A father might quietly trade in his own old titles to help fund a birthday present. The trade-in counter, more than the tills, was where Game earned its loyalty. And then came the nights that turned an ordinary high street into something closer to a festival queue. As blockbuster titles began arriving with fixed global release dates in the mid to late 2000s, Game, alongside its rivals, started holding midnight launches. Staff stayed behind after closing, doors were locked from the inside, and outside, queues of players formed hours before midnight. Sleeping bags on the pavement, portable consoles passed around to kill the time, strangers debating character builds and multiplayer maps with people they had never met and would probably never see again. When the doors finally opened, a countdown, a cheer, and then the simple pleasure of walking out into the night, clutching a game that, technically, nobody else in the country had owned for longer than a few minutes. For many who queued as teenagers, those nights became the strongest memory the brand ever gave them. Stronger, in many cases, than any single game they bought. Younger siblings tagged along on these nights because older ones refused to leave them at home. Friendships that had started at school found a second home outside Game's doors, in queues that stretched round the corner of the shopping precinct. It became, for a certain generation, less a shop and more a meeting point, the video game equivalent of the pub or the youth club, except the currency was a shared love of the same unreleased title. Employees who worked the floor during these years describe a job that, for a time, felt like being paid to run a clubhouse. Staff turnover was often low among the enthusiasts. Many were gamers first and retail workers second, and the shop rewarded that identity rather than suppressing it. Managers who understood their local customer base built real relationships. Regulars who came in every Friday. Families who trusted a particular assistant's recommendation for a 10-year-old's birthday. Students who treated the shop as a second common room between lectures. By 2007, at what many would consider the height of its powers, Game made a decisive move. It bought GameStation, its closest specialist rival, for $74 million and chose to keep both brands trading side by side on the high street. To outside observers, it looked like total dominance. One company effectively controlling the entire specialist video game retail market in Britain. There was, for a moment, no meaningful competitor left standing on the high street at all. What was it exactly about a shop built from little more than shelving, carpet tiles, and a demo television that made an entire generation feel like it belonged somewhere? Perhaps it was never really about the games on the shelf. Perhaps it was about being handed, for the first time, a place on the high street that had been built specifically for people their age, taken seriously by people who understood exactly what they loved. But even as the queues grew longer and the acquisitions grew bolder, something else was quietly gathering pace in the background. Something no amount of midnight launches or loyal trade-in customers would be able to hold back for very long. Growth is exciting to watch, and in hindsight is often where the first seeds of collapse are quietly planted. For the company that would eventually become Game, that growth happened in waves, not through slow, organic rollout, but through a sequence of acquisitions that reshaped the business again and again before most customers ever noticed a change on the shop front. The first wave came fast. Within a year of launching Future Zone, Norris and Ripley had already expanded through acquisition rather than simply opening new branches one by one. In 1993, Rhino Group bought a batch of Virgin Game stores from Virgin Retail, folding them into the growing Future Zone estate. By the end of that year, 46 stores traded under the format nationwide, and the business was edging towards profitability, a genuinely rare achievement for a young British retailer in the recession years of the early 1990s. But the company's independence did not last. In 1995, the American retailer Electronics Boutique bought a 25% stake in Rhino Group, and with that investment came a new identity. The Future Zone name, the very shop Norris and Ripley had built from nothing, was retired, and the stores were rebranded Electronics Boutique. It was the first time the business had disappeared and reappeared under someone else's name. It would not be the last. Then in 1999, Electronics Boutique Limited made its most significant move yet. It acquired a separate, established rival, a chain that had traded under the name Game since 1990 for $99 million, adding 86 stores to its estate. For a few years, Electronics Boutique and Game existed side by side under one parent company, two brands competing on the same high streets while quietly reporting to the same head office. The overlap could not last. In 2002, the company made its decision. Every Electronics Boutique store in the United Kingdom and Ireland was rebranded, one final time, as Game. The parent company took the name The Game Group plc. The shop that generations of British gamers would come to know by that single word had, in truth, already lived through three separate identities in a decade. With the name finally settled, the 2000s became the decade of pure scale. In 2004, the Game Group bought Gameplay, GB Limited, an online and mail-order retailer, and relaunched it as Game.co UK, the company's first serious foothold in internet sales, arriving years before most of the high street took online shopping seriously. In 2006, the group crossed borders entirely, acquiring the Australian specialist retailer Games Wizards and rebranding its stores under the Game name. Continental Europe followed the same pattern. Score Games in France, Centromail in Spain, a foothold in Portugal, and stores across Sweden and Denmark. By 2006, group revenues had climbed past $645 million, and the company sat comfortably on the London Stock Exchange under Chairman Peter D. Lewis and Chief Executive Martin Long. Then in May 2007 came the move that finally closed the loop on a decade and a half of consolidation. Game acquired its last remaining serious specialist competitor on the British High Street, GameStation, for $74 million. Crucially, the company chose not to fold GameStation into the Game name. The two brands kept trading separately, often on the very same high street, sometimes only a few doors apart from one another. A deliberate strategy to capture two slightly different types of customer under one parent roof. GameStation leaned into a slightly edgier, more hardcore gamer identity. Game positioned itself as the mainstream, family-friendly destination. Between them, there was now scarcely any room left on the British high street for a third specialist to survive. For staff, this decade and a half of acquisitions meant something more complicated than simple career growth. Employees who had joined under the Future Zone banner found themselves working for Electronics Boutique within a couple of years, and then for Game a few years after that. Same shop, same till, 3 different uniforms and 3 different sets of head office instructions in barely a decade. Managers absorbed from acquired chains, Virgin Game staff, Electronics Boutique veterans, former Game chain employees, had to learn new stock systems, new loyalty schemes, new corporate cultures, often with little warning. Consistency across hundreds of stores was maintained less through careful franchise training, in the American sense, and more through sheer repetition of takeover and rebrand. Whatever survived each merger became the new standard, whether staff had asked for the change or not. By the end of the decade, the physical footprint told its own story of dominance. Close to 300 Game stores stretched from city center flagships to small-town precincts, with GameStation filling in many of the gaps between them. 2 brands, 1 owner, almost no competition left standing. On paper, it looked less like a retailer and more like an entire market, wearing two different signs. It was, by any conventional measure, total victory. But total victory on the high street was about to collide with a battlefield that had never had a high street at all. By 2008, with GameStation trading alongside it on high streets nationwide, Game had reached the peak of its power. Close to 300 game stores stood alongside a further network of GameStation branches, giving the parent company a presence in the games market that no rival could realistically challenge. This was the year the business stopped being simply a successful retailer and became something closer to a national institution. The default answer for millions of British families to the question of where you bought a game. The clearest evidence of that status came not from an advertising campaign, but from the news itself. By the late 2000s, midnight launches for the biggest titles, Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, had become recurring news stories in their own right. Regional television bulletins and national papers ran footage of the same scene, year after year. Queues of young people wrapped around shopping precincts at 11 o'clock at night, sleeping bags on cold pavement, camera crews wandering the line asking why anyone would wait hours for a disc they could technically buy in daylight the next morning. Games' midnight launches had become, without anyone in marketing planning it that way, one of the most reliably photographed retail events in the country. No jingle or slogan built that recognition. The queue did it on its own. For staff working the floor during these years, the job carried a strange kind of prestige unusual for high street retail. Being a games-literate assistant at a game store during its peak meant genuine local standing among a certain age group. The member of staff who remembered your name, who'd put a copy aside under the counter because he knew you'd want it, who could be trusted to tell you honestly whether a sequel was worth the money or a disappointing cash-in. Store managers who understood their local customer base built loyalty that no head office directive could manufacture. Regulars became familiar faces. Birthdays were remembered. For some staff, particularly younger ones for whom this was a first job, it was less a retail placement and more an extension of the same culture they'd grown up inside as customers. That culture, crucially, did not stay confined to one generation. An older sibling who had queued outside Game as a teenager in 2003 might, by 2009, be the one bringing a younger brother or sister along for their first midnight launch, passing down not just a shopping habit, but an entire ritual, complete with its own unwritten rules about where to queue, what to bring, and which staff member to look out for once the doors opened. Parents who had never set foot in a game shop themselves nonetheless learned the layout of their local game by heart because it was where a birthday present or a Christmas request inevitably had to be sourced. In households across the country, the shop quietly became part of family life in exactly the way its founders, back in 1992, had hoped a dedicated games retailer eventually might. Geographically, Games reach by this point was genuinely unifying in a way few British retailers could claim. A teenager queuing outside a store in Newcastle on a Thursday night was, in every meaningful sense, having the same experience as a teenager queuing in Plymouth or Cardiff or a shopping center outside London. The layout was familiar wherever you went. The new releases wall was in roughly the same place. The trade-in counter operated by the same rules. For a country whose regions could otherwise feel a long way apart, Game had built something close to a shared national experience. One of the very few pieces of consumer culture in Britain at the time that felt genuinely the same from Aberdeen to Southampton. What was it in the end that turned a shop selling plastic discs into something people organized their evenings, their friendships, even their family traditions around? Perhaps it was never really the games themselves. Plenty of shops sold games by then, from supermarkets to Woolworth's own entertainment aisles. What Game offered that nobody else quite matched was a sense of occasion, a place that understood the calendar of a gamer's year, that turned a Tuesday release date into an actual event worth staying up for. It is worth lingering on this moment because what came next arrived quietly, almost invisibly inside the very same machines that had made those midnight queues possible in the first place. The console's games sold so successfully throughout the 2000s were, without much fanfare, being quietly rebuilt by their own manufacturers to do something no cartridge or disc ever could: connect to the internet and download a game directly, with no shop, no queue, and no trade-in counter required at all. Nobody working the tills at Game in 2008 could have named the exact moment their industry began to change. That is in many ways the nature of dramatic irony. The crack does not announce itself. It simply widens, quietly, while everyone inside the building is still celebrating the queue outside the door. The change had, in fact, already begun years earlier. Not on the high street, but inside the console's game itself had been selling so successfully. Steam, the PC digital storefront, had launched back in 2003 and was steadily building a library that made physical PC game boxes increasingly irrelevant. Microsoft's Xbox Live Marketplace and Sony's PlayStation Store, both maturing through the mid to late 2000s, gave console owners the same option consoles had never offered before: buy a game without leaving the sofa. Nintendo, slower to the idea but unwilling to be left behind entirely, opened its own eShop in 2011. For the first time in the medium's history, a customer did not need a shop at all. They needed a credit card and a broadband connection. At first, almost nobody at Game treated this as an existential threat. Digital downloads in the late 2000s were still hampered by slow home broadband speeds, restrictive data caps, and game file sizes that could take the better part of a day to download on an average British connection. Buying the disc remained, for most customers, simply the more sensible choice. Faster, more reliable, and with the added benefit of being tradable later for cash or credit, something no downloaded file could ever offer. Inside Game stores, business carried on largely as before. Midnight launches still drew their queues, trade-in counters still did brisk business, and the release calendar still dictated the rhythm of the working week. But a shift in habit rarely announces itself with a single dramatic event. It arrives in small, easily dismissed increments, the kind a shop floor notices well before a boardroom does. Staff who worked Games counters through this period began to notice something odd creeping into ordinary conversations with customers. A regular who once bought every major release on day one would mention, almost as an aside, that he'd simply downloaded the last one straight to his console the night before. No queue, no trip into town, no waiting for opening time. A teenager trading in an old title might casually mention that half his friends didn't bother buying discs for smaller games anymore. They just downloaded them, especially the cheaper indie titles that barely justified a special trip to a shop. None of this on its own looked like collapse. It looked like convenience. But convenience, multiplied across millions of customers and repeated month after month, is exactly how an entire retail model quietly loses its footing. One long-serving assistant manager, reflecting later on those years, put it simply: the shop wasn't losing customers. It was losing reasons for customers to come in for anything other than the very biggest releases. Ordinary Tuesday, once reliably busy with people picking up smaller titles, older back catalog games, or accessories, began gradually to feel quieter than they used to. Nobody could point to a single week where the change became obvious. It was closer to watching a tide go out, barely visible minute to minute, unmistakable only once you compared today's shop floor to the one from 3 years earlier. Head office was not blind to the trend, but its early response leaned toward containment rather than transformation. Investment went into strengthening the trade-in business. Games one genuine advantage that no digital storefront could replicate, since a downloaded file could never be resold for credit the way a disc could. Loyalty schemes were expanded to reward repeat physical purchases. The company doubled down on exclusive pre-order content, bonus in-game items available only if you bought the physical copy from Game specifically, a strategy designed to make the trip into the shop worth something a download alone couldn't offer. These were sensible defensive moves, and for a while, they worked well enough to mask the underlying trend in the sales figures. What the company could not fully counter, however, was the direction the industry itself was heading. Console manufacturers had every commercial incentive to push customers toward digital storefronts, where they kept a far larger share of every sale without a retailer, such as Game, taking a cut in the middle. Publishers, too, increasingly saw digital distribution as pure margin. No printing costs, no shipping, no shelf space to negotiate for. Games' very suppliers, in other words, had growing reasons to want fewer of their games sold through Games' own tills. How long could a retail chain built entirely around a physical object survive once the industry supplying that object began quietly building the machinery to sell it without a shop at all? Nobody at Game in 2009 could have answered that question with any real confidence. And in fairness, nobody in the wider retail industry could either. Music shops, video rental chains, and bookshops were only just beginning to ask the same question about their own futures, with answers that would prove sobering. For now, the queues outside Games doors on release night remained long, the trade encounters remained busy, and the company's headline figures gave little outward sign of alarm. But beneath the surface, the ground on which the entire business had been built was shifting, one download at a time, and the next few years would determine whether Game could adapt to that shift or whether it would be caught standing exactly where it had always stood, on a high street increasingly built for a different kind of shopping altogether. If Chapter 6 showed a business slowly losing its footing, this chapter shows the moment the ground gave way entirely, not through market forces beyond anyone's control, but through a sequence of financial decisions made far from any shop floor, in offices most Game customers never knew existed. By 2010, the pressure building beneath Game's headline figures had become impossible for the company's leadership to ignore entirely, even if it remained largely invisible to customers. That April, Chief Executive Lisa Morgan stepped down, replaced briefly by interim leadership before Ian Shepherd took over as Chief Executive in June 2010. Shepherd inherited a business that still looked, from the outside, remarkably healthy. Hundreds of stores, a dominant market position, two major brands trading side by side with no serious specialist competitor left standing. What he had actually inherited was a company whose entire financial structure rested on an assumption that was quietly becoming less true with every passing year: that customers would keep walking through the door to buy a physical disc. The commercial reality behind that assumption was punishing. Game operated hundreds of stores across expensive high street locations, each carrying its own lease, its own business rates, its own staffing costs, at a time when digital downloads were steadily eating into the very sales those overheads depended on. A shop selling fewer discs each year does not automatically pay less rent for the privilege of standing on the high street. Fixed costs stayed fixed. Revenue did not. That gap, widening year on year, was the mechanism quietly working against the company throughout the early 2010s, long before most customers noticed anything was wrong. Then came the decision that, in hindsight, marks the true turning point, and it was not, strictly speaking, Game's decision to make. Credit insurers, the financial institutions that underwrite the risk of a supplier not getting paid, began growing nervous about Game's underlying financial health. In response, they started withdrawing trade credit insurance on the company, effectively telling major games publishers that if they continued supplying Game with new stock on the usual payment terms, and Game later failed to pay, there would be no safety net covering that loss. For publishers, the calculation became simple and unforgiving. Keep supplying a retailer whose insurance cover was disappearing, or protect themselves by demanding cash up front, or by cutting the retailer off altogether. On 29th of February 2012, that calculation played out in public for the first time. Electronic Arts announced that it would no longer supply new titles to either Game or GameStation. The timing could scarcely have been worse. EA's catalog at that moment included Mass Effect 3, one of the most anticipated releases of the year, and Game's shelves, the very shelves that had defined the company's identity for 2 decades, would not carry it on launch day. Less than a week later, on 5th of March, Capcom followed EA's lead, pulling its own titles, including the keenly awaited Street Fighter X Tekken. Two of the industry's most significant publishers had, within the span of a single week, told the country's largest specialist games retailer that they no longer trusted it to pay its bills. For a company whose entire founding proposition, dating back to Terry Norris and Bev Ripley's original vision for Future Zone in 1992, had been the shop that takes games seriously, stocked with everything a real gamer wants. This was close to an existential wound. A game store with gaps on its new release wall, where the year's biggest titles should have been, was not simply short of stock. It was a shop no longer able to fulfill the single promise on which its entire identity had been built. Inside the stores, staff experienced this crisis not as a boardroom abstraction, but as an uncomfortable daily reality. Customers arrived asking for Mass Effect 3 and were told, often by staff who were themselves receiving conflicting or incomplete information from head office, that the game simply wasn't available and would not be for reasons nobody on the shop floor had chosen or could properly explain. Regulars who had trusted game staff for years, precisely because that staff had always known what was coming and when, now found themselves being told nothing at all. The trust that had taken 2 decades of midnight launches and honest recommendations to build began eroding in a matter of weeks. Not because staff had failed their customers, but because a financial mechanism operating several layers above the shop floor had quietly cut the ground from beneath them. Behind the scenes, the picture was even starker. Once credit insurers pull back from a retailer, the effect tends to be self-reinforcing rather than contained. Other suppliers, seeing publishers already withdrawing stock, grow cautious themselves, tightening terms or demanding faster payment, which strains cash flow further, which makes the company look even riskier, which prompts further withdrawal of cover. It is a spiral that, once started, is extraordinarily difficult for any single management decision to reverse. Shepard and his leadership team were, by early 2012, managing not a retail strategy, but a countdown, attempting to reassure remaining suppliers, landlords, and staff simultaneously, with steadily diminishing tools to do so. There is little evidence that games leadership at this stage was reckless or negligent in any simple sense. No dramatic villain extracting value while the business burned, no asset-stripping private equity owner loading the company with debt for short-term gain, in the way that pattern played out at other struggling British retailers of the era. Game in early 2012 was still a publicly listed company on the London Stock Exchange, answerable to shareholders, run by executives who had spent years building the very dominance now working against them. Its failure was less a story of deliberate greed than of a business model. Hundreds of expensive high street leases, built for an era of physical media, colliding head-on with an industry that no longer needed physical shops to sell its product. That collision did not require a villain to be devastating. It only required time. For the employees who had joined the company as teenagers, drawn in by exactly the culture Chapter 5 described. The trusted staff, the midnight launches, the sense of working somewhere that actually understood games. Early 2012 brought a particular kind of grief. They were watching the thing they loved lose its ability to deliver on its own founding promise in real time for reasons entirely outside their control. Some staff later described those weeks as feeling less like a normal difficult patch in retail and more like watching a slow-motion collision they had no way to stop and no real warning system to prepare them for. What responsibility did an entire industry bear? Publishers, credit insurers, console manufacturers alike, for building the digital infrastructure that made a shop like Game increasingly unnecessary, and then abandoning that same shop the moment its finances wobbled under the strain? It is a question with no single villain to answer it, and perhaps that is the more uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the businesses that shaped a generation's Friday afternoons are not destroyed by any one bad decision, but by an entire ecosystem quietly moving on without them. One supplier withdrawal at a time. By March 2012, the countdown that had begun with 2 publishers pulling their stock in the space of a week was approaching its conclusion. The shelves were thinner, the credit lines were nearly exhausted, and on the high streets of Britain, in stores that had once hosted queues stretching around the corner, staff were beginning to wonder not whether something would happen next, but simply when. The first sign that the public could see came just 5 weeks into 2012, and it arrived not as a headline about a shop, but as a headline about a game. On 29th February, Electronic Arts confirmed it would no longer supply new titles to Game or GameStation, among them Mass Effect 3, one of the most anticipated releases of the entire year, due on shelves the following week. Within days, Capcom followed, pulling Street Fighter X Tekken from the same shelves. For customers, this looked at first like an unusual supply hiccup. For those inside the company, it was the sound of the first serious crack becoming a structural failure. Behind the scenes, the pressure accelerated with brutal speed. On 8 March, it was reported that Game and GameStation had begun heavily discounting stock across their stores. Not as a sales promotion, but as a desperate attempt to convert unsold inventory into cash before creditors could claim it. On 14th of March, Op Capita, the private equity firm that already owned the struggling electricals chain, Comet, made a rescue bid, offering to buy Game's debt and settle its outstanding bills with suppliers in full. It should have been a lifeline. Instead, it was rejected. Game's lenders, among them the taxpayer-backed Royal Bank of Scotland, refused to accept the terms of the deal. The rescue that might have prevented what followed had been on the table, and it had been turned down. The following day, 15th of March, two of the industry's biggest names, Microsoft and Activision, announced they too would stop supplying Game with new stock. In the space of little more than 2 weeks, four of the company's most important suppliers had, one after another, decided they no longer trusted the retailer to pay its bills. On 19th of March, Game's own shares were suspended from the London Stock Exchange at the company's own request, a company effectively signaling to the market that it could no longer stand behind its own valuation. There was, by this point, very little left to negotiate. On 26th of March 2012, it became official. The Game Group entered administration. PricewaterhouseCoopers was appointed to manage the process, and Ian Shepherd, the chief executive who had spent 2 years fighting to hold the business together, stepped down the same day. The company that had once stood as the undisputed ruler of Britain's specialist games retail, the shop that Terry Norris and Bev Ripley had first imagined as Future Zone 2 decades earlier, was, in the eyes of the law, no longer able to run itself. What followed happened with a speed that stunned even seasoned retail observers. Of the 609 Game and GameStation stores still trading across the United Kingdom at the moment administration was declared, 277 were closed immediately. Not in a matter of weeks, but effectively overnight. 2,104 people lost their jobs in that single stroke, many of them finding out only when they arrived for a shift and were told, sometimes with barely more warning than a phone call the night before, that their store would not be reopening. For staff on the ground, the experience bore no resemblance to the slow, dignified wind-downs some retailers managed to offer their workforce. One moment, a store was operating normally, tills open, new stock arriving, trade-in counters processing the usual queue of customers. The next, staff were being asked to hand back keys to a shopfront that, in some cases, had employed the same manager for a decade or more. There was little time for goodbyes, and even less time for explanation. Head office itself was, in those first days, still working out precisely which stores would survive the call and which would not, a decision being made in administrators' offices in London, while shop floor staff hundreds of miles away waited by their phones for news of their own jobs. Customers experienced their own smaller, quieter version of the same shock. Regulars who walked up to a familiar shop front on an ordinary Tuesday found the shutters down, a printed notice taped inside the glass, and no member of staff left to explain what had happened. For a chain whose entire identity had been built on the personal relationship between customer and counter, the assistant who knew your name, the trade-in desk that had funded a decade of birthday presents. There was something particularly bleak about that closure being communicated through nothing more than an unmanned printed sign. Britain's newspapers and television bulletins, which only a few years earlier had filmed queues of excited teenagers outside Games doors on midnight launch nights, now filmed a very different scene outside many of the same shop fronts. Locked doors, taped up windows, and journalists asking former staff how it felt to lose a job at a company they had, in some cases, genuinely loved working for. Yet the story did not end in total ruin, and that fact in its own way makes what happened next almost harder to sit with than a simple, clean collapse would have been. On 31st March 2012, just 5 days after administration was declared, Op Capita, the same firm whose earlier rescue offer had been rejected by Game's lenders, returned and purchased the Game Group out of administration, this time on terms the administrators were prepared to accept. The deal secured the remaining 334 stores and preserved more than 3,000 jobs, a genuine, meaningful rescue for the staff who remained. But rescue is not the same as restoration. The company that emerged from administration in April 2012 was, in every practical sense, a smaller, warier version of the one that had entered it barely a week earlier. Nearly a third of its shop fronts gone, thousands of former colleagues already made redundant, and a level of trust with suppliers, landlords, and its own remaining staff that would take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. GameStation, the brand Game had bought so confidently in 2007 as the final piece of its high street dominance, did not survive the restructuring intact. In September 2012, it was announced that the GameStation name would disappear entirely, its remaining stores rebranded simply as Game. By November, the GameStation website itself had closed, its address quietly redirecting customers to Game's own online store. A brand that had queued alongside Game on the same high streets for 5 years, competed with it, and eventually been absorbed by it, vanished from Britain's shopping precincts without any real farewell of its own. A smaller casualty folded almost silently into the larger story. For the franchise-adjacent staff and long-serving employees who survived the cull, the years that followed administration carried their own quiet grief. Many had joined the company as teenagers precisely because it had once felt like the shop built for people like them. The trusted advice, the midnight launches, the sense of belonging. Chapter 5 described at its height. Now they were working inside a company that had come within days of disappearing altogether, rebuilding customer trust one till transaction at a time. Aware that the digital shift, which had triggered the crisis in the first place, had not slowed down, and would not slow down, regardless of how well the rescued business performed in the months ahead. Coverage in the press captured a mood that went beyond ordinary business reporting. This was not treated simply as a company hitting financial trouble. It was widely reported as a symbol of something larger. The moment digital distribution had visibly, undeniably, brought down one of the high street's most recognizable names. Commentators pointed to Amazon, to cheaper online retailers, and increasingly to the download button quietly built into every console Game had ever sold, as the true authors of the crisis, even as the immediate trigger had been a more mundane story of credit insurance and supplier confidence collapsing in a matter of weeks. By July 2014, Op Capita would report that the rescued business had returned to profitability, and in June that same year, Game relisted on the London Stock Exchange. On paper, a genuine recovery story, but profitability on a smaller, leaner estate was not the same as the company Game had once been. 277 storefronts that closed in March 2012 did not reopen. 2,104 redundancy notices could not be withdrawn. And the underlying force that had brought the company to its knees, a games industry steadily, permanently shifting away from anything a physical shop could sell, had not been defeated. It had simply been temporarily outrun. What remained in the aftermath was not a story of total extinction, but something arguably harder to make peace with. A beloved shop that had nearly vanished entirely, survived in diminished form, and would spend the following decades slowly, quietly continuing to shrink. Never quite disappearing and never quite recovering either. Recovery, when it came, did not look like a return to what Game had once been. It looked like a slow, steady negotiation with a smaller version of itself, one that would continue for well over a decade after the events of March 2012, and one that, remarkably, was still unfolding as recently as this year. By June 2019, the company had stabilized enough to be sold on. Op Capita, the private equity firm that had rescued Game from administration 7 years earlier, agreed to sell the business to Frasers Group, the retail conglomerate built by Mike Ashley, already the owner of Sports Direct and House of Fraser, for $52 million. At the time of the sale, Game still operated around 540 stores across the United Kingdom and Spain, a business that, while considerably smaller than its pre-2012 peak, remained a recognizable high street presence. What followed under Frasers Group ownership was not a rescue so much as a slow, deliberate absorption. Rather than continuing to operate Game as an independent chain of standalone stores, Fraser's began folding it into its existing retail estate, opening game sections inside Sports Direct branches and, in some cases, House of Fraser stores, including a flagship concession inside the Lily-White store on Piccadilly Circus, one of the most prominent retail addresses in the country. Standalone game stores, meanwhile, closed one by one, year after year, in a pattern so gradual that it rarely made national headlines the way the events of 2012 had. In January 2024, the company announced it would phase out trade-ins and pre-owned games entirely by February, quietly ending the very practice that had defined its relationship with generations of customers since the Future Zone days of the 1990s. By June that year, its long-running reward points scheme was wound down too. The final chapters of the standalone business arrived only recently. In April 2025, Games' head office in Basingstoke, the building from which the company had been run since its Game Group days, closed for good, a clear signal that whatever remained of the business was now being run from within Fraser's Group's own corporate structure rather than as anything resembling an independent company. That same month, Games' Spanish operations, some 220 stores strong, were sold to Guidebridge Capital, which continues to operate them under license, notably choosing, unlike the UK business, to invest in new stores and refurbishments rather than wind the format down. Then in January 2026, Fraser's Group confirmed its intention to place Game Retail Limited itself into administration. By April 2026, the last three standalone game stores anywhere in the United Kingdom, in Dudley, Lancaster, and Sutton, closed their doors for the final time. Managing Director Nick Aaron stepped down alongside the closures. What replaced the standalone shop, in the end, was not a rival chain triumphantly taking its customers in the way Amazon is often blamed for. It was, in the most literal sense, Game's own parent company, absorbing what remained of the brand into the concessions and online operations it already controlled. The Game name has not disappeared from Britain's shops entirely. It survives in early 2026 as a section inside Sports Direct stores, as an online retailer trading through Game.co.uk, and, in an echo of its earliest days, even as a small concession that returned to the Irish market in December 2023 inside a Sports Direct in Roscommon. But the shop as an independent destination, a place with its own front door, its own staff hired specifically because they knew games, its own trade-in counter, has, as of this year, ceased to exist. The broader industry lesson is, by now, a familiar one, though Games' version of it took an unusually long time to play out. Digital distribution did not simply erode physical games retail overnight, the way some collapses happen. It applied slow, sustained pressure across more than a decade, forcing a company to shrink, restructure, sell off pieces of itself, and finally dissolve its independent identity entirely. Not in one dramatic moment, but in dozens of smaller ones spread across 14 years. For the wider retail sector, Games' long, uneven decline has become something of a case study in how digital disruption rarely delivers a single fatal blow. More often, it delivers a slow one, absorbed a little at a time until the thing that disappears is not the brand's name, but everything that once made it feel like somewhere worth going. For the towns that lost their local branch, Dudley, Lancaster, Sutton, and the hundreds of high streets before them, the economic impact was smaller in scale than the loss of a department store or a supermarket, but no less real to the people involved. Another empty unit on a high street already struggling to fill its vacancies. Another handful of local jobs gone. Another small piece of a town's identity quietly removed. What does it mean in the end when a brand does not die but simply keeps shrinking year after year until almost nothing independent is left of the thing people once queued around the block to visit? Perhaps that question matters more, not less, than a clean and sudden collapse would. Because there was no single funeral to attend, no final closing day that made the national news the way administration did in 2012. There was only a slow, quiet fading, still happening as the story is being told. Picture it one last time exactly as it was. 3:30 on a weekday afternoon, and the door swings open to that particular smell. New plastic casing, carpet tile, The faint electrical warmth of a demo television left running all day on a loop nobody ever switched off. The new releases wall stands at the back, lit slightly brighter than the rest of the shop, the way a church window might be lit brighter than the pews around it. A member of staff who actually knows the difference between this year's football game and last year's leans over the counter, unprompted, to tell you honestly whether it's worth the money. Somewhere near the till, a stack of traded-in cases waits to be shelved, each one a small transaction of somebody else's outgrown enthusiasm becoming somebody else's next favorite thing. And outside, on a handful of nights each year, a queue forms before midnight. Sleeping bags on cold pavement, strangers trading theories about a game none of them have played yet, a countdown, a cheer, and then the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of walking home holding something nobody else in the country had owned for longer than a few minutes. It would be easy to say Game only ever sold plastic discs, and in the narrowest sense, that would even be true. But that was never really what the shop gave people, and it was never really what people came back for. Game gave a generation of British children and teenagers something the rest of the high street had never quite offered them. A place built specifically around what they loved, staffed by people who took that love seriously rather than tolerating it. For families with little money to spare, the trade-in counter was not a marginal convenience, but a genuine mechanism of fairness. A way for a child's collection to grow without a parent's wallet emptying every time. For siblings, it became a rite of passage, an older brother or sister leading a younger one into their first midnight queue, passing down a ritual the way other families pass down a favorite football team or a particular Christmas tradition. For staff, it offered something rarer still in retail work, a job where being genuinely knowledgeable and enthusiastic about the product was not merely tolerated but actively rewarded, where regulars became something closer to friends than customers. What Game enabled, in the end, was not really about the games at all. It was about belonging somewhere, on the high street at an age when very few places were built with you specifically in mind. Something Real closed its doors between March 2012 and April 2026, even if the closing never arrived as a single dramatic ending. It closed a little at a time, one storefront after another, until a shop that had once stood on nearly every high street in Britain survived only as a section inside somebody else's business. That is worth acknowledging plainly, without exaggeration and without bitterness. Terry Norris and Bev Ripley set out, back in 1992, to build a shop that finally took games seriously, and for the better part of 2 decades, that is exactly what they gave the country. The staff who worked those counters, the franchise and store managers who built loyal local followings, one honest recommendation at a time. The customers who queued through cold nights for the simple pleasure of being first. All of it was real, and all of it mattered to the people who lived it, whatever the balance sheets eventually decided. Nobody set out to destroy that. An entire industry simply moved on to a version of itself that no longer required a shop at all. And Game, for all its dominance, could only slow that shift, never stop it. What remains is not a business to eulogize and not a villain to blame, but a memory worth keeping honestly, of a shop that, for a while, made a Tuesday afternoon feel like somewhere worth being.